Case is very excited to welcome Dr. Beth Green as our guest speaker today. Dr. Green is the program director for Cardus Education. Was previously part of the international research team that developed What If Learning in partnership with Transforming Lives. She's also done work for the Cardus Institute for Christian Teaching and Learning at Calvin College, and she has a wonderful resume in education. She also directed the National Center for Christian Education at Liverpool Hope University in the UK, where she also ran the Professional Doctorate in Education program. Dr. Green has an international reputation for her expertise in religious school ethos, leadership and management, teaching and learning, and social theory in education. She's also a former high school history teacher who's worked with both government and non-government schools in the UK. But even more importantly, she's just a great friend of Christian educators, and she's a great friend of Case, and we're excited to have her today. Welcome, Dr. Green. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you for your friendship. Case has been a really important way for me to kind of intersect with Christian education in its different forms here in North America. It's been quite a learning curve for me, jumping this side of the ocean. So I'm very grateful to you guys for all that I'm learning in the friendship with you. So the way that the next kind of hours is going to run is hopefully it will not just be me talking the whole of the time. I want to kind of bring you up to speed with a very major empirical research study that Cardus Education has been working on. The most recent version of the Cardus Education Survey was released last year, and it's a study of graduate outcomes so that we can actually say some meaningful things about the influence that going to a Christian school has on the choices that our graduates make in their adult lives. So there's going to be three parts to this presentation. First of all, I just want to give you some context about why research like this might matter, why it's worth doing, why Cardus does it, who Cardus are. You may not have heard of us. Then I'm actually going to introduce you to some graduates from our survey, because it's always really helpful to see the faces of the students and find out a little bit about what their lives look like kind of 10, 15 years on from the time that they were at a school, perhaps like the one that you're involved in. And then the third section, we're going to look at the implications for this research, the ways in which you might actually be able to use it in the classrooms and the institutions that you're a part of. And I've kind of agreed with Eric that I'm going to pause at the end of each of those three sections so that people have a time to table questions. I mean, you should send them to Eric all the way through, just like he said, and then, you know, maybe he can just mediate that discussion. And I'm happy to talk to anything that that you want me to. So I'm going to start with a little bit of context for the Cardus Education Survey. The 2016 survey, which is our most recent data, was actually a study of Canadian graduate outcomes. But there are some direct implications from that study for private Christian schools in the US as well, which I want to share with you at the outset so that you don't feel that you're sitting through a whole presentation from a strange country that may not be relevant to you. We actually commissioned an independent set of eyes to kind of comb through our data and look at them from the US policy perspective. So my thanks go to Emily McCord at the Clapham Group in DC, who did this for me. And the kind of implications that she drew out, it's worth noting that they're actually being circulated quite strategically to some of the leading voices and policymakers in our US networks. And the next time that Cardus specifically surveys US graduates will be in 2018. So the first kind of key finding that I think is relevant to you guys in the US context is that graduates of evangelical Protestant schools are more likely to attend church, observe religious disciplines, and strengthen their relationship with God than public school graduates. And that's the kind of sector effect that you might think, well, yeah, so what? What does that tell me? But I'm going to come on to why that might be important just in a moment. The second finding that I think is particularly important is that graduates from independent schools generally feel more prepared by their high school experiences for college and the workforce than do public school graduates. And what I'm building up here is a layer of sector effects that say there's something different about the social capital, the religious capital that non-government schools bring into the equation in terms of the experience of education that graduates report that they had. There's a challenge coming out of our survey, which is that education in most, if not all, school sectors is falling prey to a lack of imagination. And whilst we do see some clear advantages for those students who are attending Christian schools, I still think there are ways in which, if we were honest about what we see in the data, the work that we do could be even more significant in terms of thinking about the ways our institutions work as signposts to the kingdom of God. So I'm thinking there about, well, what does it mean to have a prophetic imagination, an idea of Christian education that that offers something really distinctive to the profile of graduate outcomes. And then the final implication that we've picked out as particularly relevant to the US context as well is that students from non-public schools were found to be more involved in community and cultural events and organizations, be more civically active by voting and protesting, and giving more of their time and money through volunteering and donations. And it's important to say that that kind of level of involvement is above and beyond the religious community of which they might already be a part. So it's not just stuff they do in the church, it's about how their time at a Christian school is equipping them for service in their community above and beyond the boundaries of the church. So this report is actually the fourth in a whole suite of studies that have been comparing school sector effects in the US and Canada since 2011. It's the only major research study that collects this data. So what's interesting is that it's rapidly becoming the benchmark study, not just for religious schools, but for non-government schools, if you want to look at outcomes in North America by school sector. And that gives Cardus a really helpful platform to be able to talk about the particular contribution of Christian schools, although we do report on a broader range of school sectors than that in the whole report. So here's a question for you. Why collect this kind of data? Because I'm very aware with my background as an education practitioner and somebody who used to train teachers and lead on research, that measurement is a double-edged sword, or it can be a double-edged sword. Big data, particularly this kind of big statistical survey of a representative sample, is really dominant narrative in education policy at the moment. And it can be a problem, especially if that kind of data is used to support very reductionist and utilitarian concepts of what education is for. So the idea that as long as we can show people are equipped to get a good job and a good level of income, tick the box, that's all we need worry about. Or we can see it in some of the problematic international comparisons like PISA, for example. Now, I think PISA is useful, but I also think that there's lots of questions about what we're really comparing and the implications of things like, well, what pedagogy, what curriculum do you use? And I know that some teachers in some schools feel very browbeaten by the idea of big data and measurement. I've written elsewhere about this at length, and I think it's really essential for Christian education to imagine its relationship to the state, to be able to offer alternative curriculum and pedagogy that engage with the formation of the whole person, and to be willing to re-envision what excellent school culture might look like in the light of the kingdom of God. So why am I selling out to big data and this obsession with graduate outcomes and the conversation about measurement and excellence? Well, I don't think I am selling out. And I want to take a moment here just to tell you briefly about the posture that we adopt at Cardus, because it's really relevant to the story that the Cardus Education Survey data tells. Cardus is a social policy think tank dedicated to the renewal of North American social architecture. That means that we believe independent and original research is essential to engaging a wide audience, an audience in Canada and in the US who have forgotten how much of our social infrastructure and the values that underpin it depends on the Judeo-Christian tradition. So we believe that it's essential both to engaging the church and our society that we don't buy fully into the liberal secular assumption that religion is a private matter, a private story to be kept out of our public and institutional life. And I would like to argue that with the Cardus Education Survey, we are really upfront about the fact that education is not just about academics. It's not less than that. And it's really important to prepare the next generation well for the jobs that they're going to do. But it's about more than this. And we are going to forget about the impact of schooling on social relationships, on religious orientation, on generosity, public life, and civic engagement at our peril. If those things drop out, if we stop measuring them, which most kind of government policy indicators don't include, then we are going to end up living very separate, distant lives from one another. And Christian education has, within that context, to be able to articulate what a distinctive contribution it makes in those areas. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to defend our religious freedom as institutions. It's going to be difficult to persuade parents that there's any reason why they should choose a Christian school from the smorgasbord that's available in the education marketplace. And here in Canada, we're already facing significant and orchestrated attack on the freedom of religious institutions. I'm very proud of the photograph that you might be able to see on the PowerPoint just at the moment, because that's my two nephews and my niece hanging off the pull bars there. But I use it to illustrate quite an important point, which is that to win the long-term victories, to change the way that we think about the institution of education and its contribution, you actually have to influence how a rising generation thinks. A generation that no longer is as biblically literate, no longer necessarily assumes that, even if they are Christians in a church context, that Christian education is something they should buy into as parents. And one of the things that the Cardus Education Survey has done, which is so important, is consistently report data which busts the myth that Christian schools in America and Canada necessarily produce graduates who are politically extremist, socially isolated, and intolerant. Because one of the stories that we're up against is if you send your children, like my nephews and niece, to a Christian school, they will not be able to participate fully in the life of the community and the society of which they're a part. Our findings report significant sector advantages in Christian schools across the measures of civic and community engagement. And even with that solid body of research evidence behind us, it's not easy to get that message out. But the data is necessary to be in with a chance of changing the story. So actually, by expanding the range of what we measure to social, religious, cultural, and political outcomes, we're changing the conversation about what education might be for and what matters in education. And I argue that changing that conversation in the research is a distinctively Christian contribution to education, research and measurement and policy. And that might matter even more so as we move into what's already being described as a post-truth political and policy world. So before I take the next step and introduce you a little bit to the graduates in our survey and tell you a little bit about what we're finding, Eric, this might be a point to take any broad picture questions if some of them have come through. They might not have, but if they have.
And if Tim, if you have a question, it's always I think a good place to ask the question about data and research and how much of it is descriptive and how much of it is prescriptive in a sense, and how do we make sure that we use it well but not overuse it.
That's right. So you're anticipating some of the things I'm going to talk about in the third section of the presentation, but just to give you a kind of heads up, our data is descriptive. So it's capturing a snapshot. And that is, if you like, a kind of mapping of the field exercise, because without those kinds of benchmarks, it's harder to make both a public defense of the contribution of Christian education, but also to have kind of sensible conversations amongst yourselves about whether the resources, the leadership, the kind of teaching that you've been pouring, usually at great cost and expense to yourself, like into the community, is actually shaping graduates in the way that you want. So my argument is that research is, when it's done well, empirical research is a combination of both mapping the fields and also shaping the conversations. And because I think sometimes we think that prescriptive is a negative thing, but actually, if it's a way to hold us accountable to our mission goals, to strategies that we know are good for educational achievement, to be able to set targets, then those are all, as teachers, we would say that those were sensible things to do in kind of the act of learning. And I actually think that sometimes doing research is a bit like a big institutional learning project. And then it's important to say we shouldn't just be reliant on one approach. So where I think the big data that we offer is useful is in mapping these broad trends. If what you want to do, though, is drill down a little bit more perhaps into the school that you work at or a school that you're affiliated with, and look at the progress of a particular cohort of students, or capture some data about pedagogy or curriculum, this data set won't help you to do that. And it would be a problem if you started to rely on it to make decisions in those spaces. So I would say you need a range, and you need to be aware of which research tools answer which research questions.
Great. And I think the next question that came up, you're going to get to here in the next section. So I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to...
Yeah, go ahead.
So I want to move on to telling a little bit more about how the Cardus Education Survey works, and to introduce you to some of the graduates. I should say that the full report, including, if you happen to be a stats geek, all of the regression models, are available online from the Cardus website. And we don't have time to meet everybody today, so I'm going to focus on the findings in relation to graduates from Protestant evangelical Christian schools in Canada. But I thought that you might like to see see our graduates, meet the people that we're talking about in our research. So Cardus surveys respondents who are between the ages of 29 and 40 years old. It's really important to remember that, because this is a snapshot of what their experience at school was like 10 to 15 years ago, and I'll come on to the reasons why that's important in just a moment. In Canada, there are some sort of sector differences from the way that schooling systems are organized in the US. So if we want to kind of speak to everybody and get a sense of the broad sector experiences, we have to survey people who went to Catholic independent schools, students who went to separate Catholic schools, which are entirely publicly funded but have their own, they kind of mimic the public school system in Canada's major provinces, but they have their own boards, and they have their own Catholic boards and their own Catholic governance structures. We also have to survey people who were homeschooled for religious or non-religious reasons, and there's always a mixture of different motivations when it comes to homeschooling. And we have to survey people who went to independent schools that are non-religious, and we've surveyed graduates who went to evangelical Protestant schools. And if you want to ask me a little bit more about our definitions of evangelicalism and how that works north of the border, we can talk about that. And so they're represented in this wonderful illustration here. We've given them some names by Alex, Olivia, Brian, Nora, Mia, and Aman. And I want to just make a really important point about Olivia to start with. Olivia represents graduates of our public school system here in Canada. And it's worth making the point that something between, depends which province you're in, but 93 to 98% of graduates in Canada will have been to a public school. So that means that Olivia's is the majority story. It's the story against which we measure all of the other school sectors. So when I talk about Brian in a moment, who represents graduates from evangelical Protestant schools, what I'm actually essentially doing with the data is saying, Olivia's the baseline. How much more different or similar is Brian's experience to Olivia's? Actually, in the US, it's the same. The vast majority of students attend public schools. And so if you want to look at our most recent US report, which was published in 2014, it's the same comparison. It's the evangelical Protestant graduate to Olivia, because the temptations to line them all up and say, well, how is Brian different to Nora? How is Nora different to Mia? You can do that to some extent, but you'd need to do some different math. The main comparison our report is looking at is how similar or different is Brian's experience to Olivia's. Sorry, that was the kind of like the geeky bit at the beginning that the statisticians I work with at the University of Notre Dame who do this data collection for me would be like really insistent that I give you. So as I say, we don't have time to work through the profiles of all these graduates separately. I would encourage you to do that for yourself. I want to zero in on Brian, because there are broad similarities between how the independent Christian school sector works in the US and in Canada that makes comparisons useful. Quite a lot of our independent Christian schools in Canada are affiliated to organizations like CSI, ACSI, groups that kind of cross the parallel. And remember that we are talking about sector differences, not the differences, so the effects of an individual school. As I mentioned before, we're following up on graduates who are between the ages of 29 and 40. And that's really important methodologically, because any earlier and respondents' lives are insufficiently kind of settled for us to collect meaningful data about how school sector has affected their adult choices. So let me take you through the kind of highlights in relation to Brian's experience. So Brian is no more likely than Olivia, our public school graduates, to be in full-time employment. The likelihood's the same there. But if you look at the kind of job he does, there is a greater likelihood that he'll be in a managerial or a professional role. There's actually no statistical difference in relation to Brian's educational attainment after high school. This is an interesting one because Brian is more likely than Olivia to be geographically mobile. That means he's not only likely to be living in his current house for a shorter period of time, but he's more likely to have changed cities than a public school graduate. It's not entirely clear what the reason for this is, but the dislocation that seeking out a post-secondary institution with a similar religious affiliation in Canada might be one reason, because we don't have the same number of Christian liberal arts universities that you have in the US. It could be that this mobility is tied to job availability, particularly if he's more likely to be in a managerial or professional role. But what this does show is that these graduates are not sequestered into religious communities surrounded by members of family and church. When we line it up with some of the other data on the nature of their social ties and connections, we see that they're likely to be transplanted into new areas of the country and of the world. Brian is more likely than Olivia to eat, pray, and read the Bible with his family. And it's really important to just note that we mustn't make the mistake of assuming that public school graduates are not Christians. There are many Christian families who send their students to public schools. So and we also can't always make the assumption that our graduates from Christian schools still identify as Christians. So this is about the extent to which the sector is reinforcing or contrasting values that might be important to a Christian family or a Christian home. This bar chart is a little difficult to read. I apologize for that. So I'll just talk to you about basically what it represents. It's basically showing us that Brian has a greater number of closer ties than Olivia, our public school graduate, but only by a small margin. It's more interesting to look at who the close ties are likely to be, because it's just as likely that their close ties are family members or parents. It's also just as likely that Brian has a friend who is from another race or ethnic group. He's less likely to have close ties who are co-workers. So that means a lot of his friendships come through the religious church Christian community that Brian is involved with. Brian's just as likely to know an elected public official, a community leader, or a corporate executive as Olivia. So what's this about? Why does it matter who Brian is friends with, who he trusts, who he knows? Well, what this kind of data does is help us to map the networks of evangelical Protestant graduates. Because one of the stereotypes out there about the sector effects of Christian schooling is that graduates of Christian schools are likely to be socially isolated and only relate to people who are the same as them. We find some evidence of religious encapsulation, but it's not as strong an identifier as we might expect. So in layman's terms, what this does is help us to bust the myth that attending a religious school de facto results in your social isolation. Brian is just as likely as Olivia to look for a job that fulfills religious calling, but seems to be less interested in pursuing work that fulfills a creative vocation. It's interesting because that finding's been consistent across our Canadian and US data in 2012 and 2014. We want to explore a little bit more if it's a problem with our question. Is it something about the way we ask them about creative and performing arts? Or is it reflective of the fact that this is not something that's seen as a ministry area or a valuable place to pursue gifts? Or I'd like to do some more exploring around that, because it keeps popping up and we're not sure what's behind that finding. Brian is just as likely as Olivia to trust society and have confidence in its institutions. He is far more likely than Olivia, our public school graduate, to trust religion, but not less likely, to see society as hostile to his values. And I'm interested by that one, because quite a lot of the time our assumption is that Christians feel that society is becoming more secularized and more hostile to the values that they hold. We're not finding that for this group of graduates between the ages of 29 and 40. Now, at this point, I would like you to meet Mia, because Mia was homeschooled for religious reasons. And as we delve further into the religious outcomes data, I think you might be interested to know that both Brian and Mia, who represent our Protestant evangelical and our homeschool graduates, have nearly identical results in terms of religious beliefs and behaviours. And those results are statistically significant. They set them apart quite soundly from the sector effect that we see amongst our public school graduates. Now, remember, this is school effect that we're reporting here. We're controlling for things like the religiosity of parents and family members and those prior socio and economic variables. And you should feel free to grill me on the methodological issue around reporting school effect for somebody who's been homeschooled. I'm including the data in this presentation because, in my view, it does point to the significance of the distinct mission integrity of a religious school, that it likely reinforces in important ways the habits of distinct religious community. The legal term that kind of covers this, I guess, is the idea of parentis. It's the idea that the school or the experience of schooling in the homeschool context should fully be in the place of the parent. It should represent and support the values and philosophical beliefs of the parents. That concept's being lost, indeed actively undermined in the Canadian public conception of the role of education. And I still think it's something that is quite important, and which religious schools take very seriously, and obviously in the homeschool context it's paramount. So Mia and Brian, they both attend church more frequently than Olivia, our public school graduate. They're more likely to observe regular religious disciplines and to prioritize strengthening their relationship with God. They're also more likely to donate 10% of their income, to pray alone, and to read the Bible. Brian and Olivia are significantly more likely to make moral decisions based on scripture than Olivia, our public school graduate, and also significantly more likely to believe that God is a personal being, to believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible, to believe in a single path to salvation through Jesus, find fulfillment in their spirituality, feel obligated to their church, and to obey the church's authority. And you will be aware that those are all kind of measures of Orthodox Christian belief and practice. I'm going to wave goodbye to Mia for just a moment. And what I want to do is wrap up here by considering what evidence there is in the data of the ways in which attending a evangelical Protestant school also impacts the political and civic engagement of Brian. So I have a question that I would like you to think about and reflect on as I move through this data. And that question is, what are your expectations for your graduates in these areas of life? In other words, if you kind of conjure up an image of the alumni of the school that you're associated with, or maybe even current students, what would you expect to see in terms of their political and civic engagement? And that might be something that you explicitly talk about at the institution that you're involved with. It might be part of your ethos statement. Maybe it isn't. But either way, just have that question kind of hovering in the back of your mind, because I think it will be useful. So Brian is more likely than Olivia to donate, to go on relief and mission trips, and to volunteer in non-congregational settings. So that's above and beyond the church community, as I was kind of talking about the importance of that earlier. This one's interesting. Brian's actually more likely to participate in a seniors group. And I think that the data like this is quite interesting in terms of how we think about social encapsulation, how lives are connected across peer groups, what opportunities the religious school sector has to contribute in positive ways to some of those social identifiers and practices. Brian is more likely to feel a responsibility to help those in need than a graduate of a public school. To me, this indicates that the evangelical Protestant sector is managing to cultivate graduates who have a healthy sense of love for their neighbour in a manner that influences behaviour well past the secondary school years. There are just 3 more findings that I want to share with you before I pause and take questions. And I apologise because for some reason I haven't got the slides available for these 3 findings. But we did find that overall Brian was less likely than Olivia to be involved in political activities. And also in terms of civic participation, there were no real differences on measures of activity. So things like joining a membership association. The only exception to that was the participation in a seniors group. So Eric, I'm going to pause there before I talk about implications and move on to framing the new conversation, because I guess that people might have some questions. And of course, I haven't reported on the other graduates in our studies, and if anybody's interested in any of those, I can talk a little bit about the findings in relation to them as well.
So Beth, you know, as people have the opportunity to type in questions to the chat box, you know, when we look at this in these questions, you use the term distinctive quite a bit, and you talk about the distinctive nature of evangelical Protestant schools or Christian schools. What are you seeing in the North American studies, Canada, United States, the similarities? What are you seeing come across as these are the distinctives that really set Christian schools or these evangelical Protestant schools apart?
So I think I have a number of different answers to that. Some are more positive than others. So one thing that I think is a really positive finding is this intentional, or it feels like an intentional practice. I guess I need to be careful about what I can say just on the basis of the descriptive data, but this sense that other people in society are your responsibility, and that's not just something that is indicated by a response on the survey to say, yes, I think it's my responsibility to help people in need. It's actually backed up by other indications on our survey, like how much you volunteer of your own time above and beyond the religious community, how much you tithe. We ask a whole bank of questions about kind of practices that sociologists typically use as measures of things like generosity and giving, and how connected people are. You know, it ranges from, you know, do you give blood, how many hours do you volunteer, and the fact that the graduates of Protestant evangelical schools have such a distinctive profile in these areas. And remember, we're controlling for the prior effects of family religiosity and the fact that these might be practices that are also encouraged in their church community. So we are isolating a school effect here. That to me suggests that that's a really something that's very distinctive, that's very intentional, that's very positive. Because I think that's quite a big, we're not seeing that in relation to our public school graduates to the same extent, right? So that's giving us, that would give me some concern about what the future narrative is going to be about our attitude to loving our neighbour and to being involved in their lives. And it would seem that there's a lot of potential in Christian schools to be intentional about that. Where I'm a little bit more cautious is that some of what we're finding, and this was a difference more in the US data in 2014 than in the current Canadian data. We found in the last US survey that the graduates of independent Catholic schools were kind of stronger in some of these intentional practices of kind of like community group membership and a giving of time than Protestant evangelical students were. Where Protestant evangelical students was kind of, we were seeing the distinctive profile is in relation to pietistic practice. Now, things like prayer and things like reading your Bible and kind of those orthodox responses on religious beliefs and values are really important. I wouldn't ever say that they shouldn't be part of what a Christian school exists to foster and support and develop in terms of students. But responding about issues of belief is methodologically, I want to go a step further and say, how am I seeing that being translated into a different posture, a different attitude? Because it's very easy to tick. We all know this. It's very easy to tick the right answers about things that we believe. I want to think about how do we intentionally put that into practice in different ways in community life. And Catholic schools had a stronger profile last time we surveyed the US than Protestant evangelical students did in that domain. Some of that might be about the questions we ask. I'd be willing to take critique on that. And I think this is where your question about the difference between descriptive and prescriptive research and data comes in. But I don't just want to foster pietism. I want people whose formation, spiritual and religious formation, means that they're ambassadors in the communities that they live in. They're connected to people, and I think there's still a challenge to Christian schools in that space.
So Beth, I think one of the things, when we talk about this research and when you share this, there seems to be a little bit of an absence to some of what we would expect to be the focus of school and the academic attainment and achievement of someone like Brian.
Yes, so one of the things that's caused some surprise as we've presented this data to our audiences is that there isn't a distinctive difference between Brian and our public school graduates on academic distinctiveness. Now, I'm always careful because it's not, this isn't a qualitative measure of how well Brian, how good Brian's grades are, and it's not necessarily the measure of education in its totality, the amount someone earns. On the other hand, given that other school sectors that we report on in this survey, so the Catholic independent school sector and the non-religious independent school sector, do better in terms of educational attainment, academic trajectories, and kind of the vocational trajectory. There's a question then about how we are pursuing excellence vocationally, I think, in relation to some of those things, and how we're building social capital, because it's not that we shouldn't be, as Christian school educators, valuing those things. I think we have to understand rightly what they're for. But if you kind of play this forward in terms of where some of these people end up, where some of our graduates end up as influencers and thought leaders within society, there's a greater representative of the other school sectors in some of those kinds of spaces that will, where people will have influence on our social institutions and who will be leaders, than there is from the Protestant evangelical school sector. And I think we have to talk about that. Yeah. So
Tim has a question, and he was wondering about some of the civic activity, but when you look at the data on Brian and on evangelical Protestant graduates, is there a reason why they're not more likely to be active in civic activities, or do we have information on that?
So this is where I'm at the limits of descriptive statistics, because I can't ask the question of my graduates in this survey, why, what's behind these choices. I can give you a few hunches. So one thing I think we need to be, I would want to review is how the population's own understanding of civic engagement is changing, because we're seeing in the current kind of cultural and political climate, people less willing to actually be active paid up members of political parties, for example, or to join protests. Now that may, in the light of the recent US elections, be changing a little bit, but it could be that people are engaged, but not in the kind of traditional ways that we understood civic and political engagement, in which case the onus is on us to perhaps be a bit more creative with some of the ways that we ask questions. However, I don't think that's going to be the entire explanation. I can tell you one of my hunches, and this is something I'm a little bit concerned about, is the extent to which we as the Christian church have actually bought into one of the dominant cultural narratives, which is that our religion is a private matter. And that actually most of our involvement is in the church space and the kind of community of church space understood as my private life, and that we too have retreated from engagement in the public space. And I think we have to look at the extent to which we've bought into this myth that the public space is just what's government run, and that religion doesn't belong in there. I think one of the things that can happen is that we can reinforce the idea that religion isn't relevant in those spaces, and that I as a Christian don't have something legitimate or distinctive to contribute. And that to me is not the message of the kingdom of God. So I'd love us to be able to have a conversation about that, and to have a vision of the public space where civic and political engagement happen that is much bigger and much more expansive. And I wonder whether we do have that, and I wonder whether we are teaching about that in our schools. Now that's just my hypothesis. I can't demonstrate that from the empirical data. I want to be clear about that, but that's the hunch I have.
So as you shift, to this last part, of of the presentation and you know, and talk a little bit about what it means from a policy standpoint and what Cardus is doing and how this, you know, because we walk into a very, you know, different time in the United States.
Sure do.
With some ed policy here coming up. And even in North America, what's going on in Canada and even other parts of, especially the English-speaking world with education. But when we look at this data, is there any advice that when we read the reports, you know, from the past to the current, when we look at North America as a whole, Canada and the United States is different, what are some things that you would really focus in on to a Christian school leader or leaders of schools to say, here's something that to really begin to think about and push yourself on for the quality practice of your institution?
Okay, yeah. I mean, to wrap up, what I've tried to do is think about how this data can help you to have a new conversation, and how those conversations might play out with school administrators, with your school boards, perhaps with professional educators, teachers, as well as parents. Sometimes a report like this can feel very, very kind of theoretical and very high level. I'm hoping it feels less like that because you've got a picture of Brian and some of the other graduates. But I've got some examples of how you might want to start these conversations, kind of built out from the way that Cardus uses the data. So the first one is this data is a good way to start a conversation about what measurement can do for you in your school community, and how to measure things well. So one of the things that I think can happen is that our conversations about kind of tracking our school's progress towards strategic development goals that we have as administrators, and the way that we present these to board members, to prospective parents. We can often talk about this very much from within our own echo chamber, and I would never say that the stories of kind of alumni and live examples you have from amongst your own graduates are not powerful. I think they're really important, but I think you maximize the contribution of those kinds of that kind of storytelling if you can map it against national benchmarks. So if you take a report like this and you could just look at you know, you could just look at Brian, you could even pick, it's organized into sections, so you could pick the data on academics, you could pick the data on religious beliefs and practices, you could pick the section on generosity and giving, and you could ask that question that I framed earlier. Okay, what are our expectations of our graduates? Here's the national picture. Imagine a sliding scale. You know, where would we say we are? And it will be an approximate measure, but it's a good way to start a conversation, because you might disagree with some of the goals that we've assumed are important. But unless you build your institutional conversation around good questions and good data, it's difficult then to invite other people to participate into it, or to present it kind of public facing in terms of the distinctive stories that you kind of want to present about what your school does. So one of the ways in which I've seen this report used quite effectively by school principals is as an education tool for their board members. Quite often you'll get really gifted people serving on boards, but who don't have a background in education themselves, apart from the fact that they went to school. And that can sometimes mean that they're very driven by the first part of our report, which is the academic trajectory, and less aware of how to talk well and how to measure well the broader profile of a graduate. And yet when you start to talk to them, particularly board members who are employers or who work in businesses, about their kind of experience of leading and working within those organizations, they probably will recognize that it matters the kind of person, your character matters to the way that you engage in the world of work, and the way that you engage in family, and the way that you engage in your local community. But quite often when they're presented with reports from school administrators, they will go straight to the academics. So one of the things that this data can do is prompt a conversation about the full range of measures that actually matter for your school, and how you encourage boards to talk about those things well. And one of the other things, another of the conversations that this kind of data can do, is hopefully engage teachers in a more positive way with the rigor of empirical research. I mentioned at the start of my talk that many teachers feel very browbeaten by the agenda of measurement. This report's a much more kind of positive way of talking to them about how to envisage who the students in their classroom are going to become in 15 and 20 years' time, and why actually being able to accurately track that matters. We do actually have a tool that schools can use called the Private School Assessment Tool, which is related to our main study, but it's a questionnaire that you can survey your grade 9 students, grade 12 for high school, grade 12 students, parents, alumni, and teachers, and kind of get a sense of, okay, these are the core values that matter to us in our school. What do teachers think they're teaching and covering in their lessons? What is it that year 9 and year 12 are picking up on? And because does that change because you follow a group of students through across 5 years in this tool? And what do parents think is going on? And the tool enables you to overlay those stories. And it's really interesting to see where the gaps are and where you might need to identify some opportunities for professional development, and to see where you're being successful and where those messages and those stories are coinciding in the teaching. If anybody's interested in the Private School Assessment Survey tool that we offer, the best thing to do is to drop me an email at Cardus and I can send you some more details. Cardus uses the data. So sorry, I've talked there about how to promote a conversation, perhaps to educate your board a little bit more about what they should be expecting in terms of graduate outcomes. I've spoken about the fact that it helps support an external conversation about what's distinctive. I've talked about the fact that it's a better example for teachers of the relevance of big data in measurement, not as something to beat them over the head with, but to accurately track and measure the kind of long-term outcomes. And I've talked a little bit about how you can measure what's currently happening in your institution as well using a related tool. Finally, what I want to do is just say very quickly a little bit about how Cardus uses this data in the policy domain, because most of my time is spent now more at the kind of systems level, arguing for the importance of the freedom for Christian schools to operate institutionally and teach their curriculum and pedagogy, integrating faith and learning, and from an explicitly Christian position. And also trying to refresh some of the ways that we think institutionally about Christian education itself. So I just wanted to give you some examples of spaces where Cardus is engaged in conversation. The first one is we have used the data from the Cardus Education Survey to issue a challenge to some of the other I'm not very fond of this word, but I'm going to use it anyway, stakeholders in education. So we need a broader range of people advocating for diversity in education, a wider group of people who will support us in our Christian schools. So Cardus wrote a report called Business Gone Quiet, which is a policy paper that addresses the business community in Canada and says you spend a lot of your time advocating for improvements in curriculum, particularly through K-12, literacy, numeracy, basic skills, but you're very silent on actual models of education provision. And yet you would be quick to say that diversity matters in the delivery of other public services. Why do you not challenge the dominance and the monopoly of the public school system in Canada's provinces? Why not get on board and say, making space for Christian schools to operate freely, for independent schools to operate freely, is good for all of us. So that's one way we use the data. Another way we've used it in very practical pedagogic terms is to create an excellence award for teaching and learning. We took the data, we looked at some of the areas where the graduates of Christian schools didn't have the distinctive profiles that we thought maybe we might expect, and we've built an award that at the moment it's you can apply for it if you're a Christian school teacher working in a Christian school in Ontario, and awards are themselves a mechanism of changing cultural practice. So just by the process of having to go through nomination and application, we're celebrating the good practice that already happens in Christian schools in Ontario. We're publicising it. We're making more people aware of what's going on, and we're kind of raising the game in terms of approaches to pedagogy, academics, curriculum. But we've thought very long and hard theologically about how we might understand excellence well from a Christian perspective, and what it's for, how it should bless the community. And so you can't win a teacher excellence award unless your practice blesses the school that you're in, and other people will attest to how that happens. So that's really exciting. In fact, closing dates for this year's awards are 1st of February. So we're looking forward to seeing the nominations come in for that. I'm also involved, as you mentioned, Tim, at the very beginning of this presentation, with pedagogic initiatives that integrate faith and learning. So I worked on an approach that some of you might be aware of called What If Learning. David Smith at Calvin College in Grand Rapids has built on that with his Teach Fastly initiative, which works in the science and religion space. We have data, we have a science and religion module in our Christian education survey. So we're also thinking about how we can map the descriptive statistics onto the kind of faith and learning piece, and encourage engagement with like controversial issues, good practices and ways of teaching, just to improve the current practice in our institutions. Finally, I just want to mention the Cardus Religious Schools Initiative. The Cardus Religious Schools Initiative is based at the University of Notre Dame, and I oversee their work. They do the bulk of the kind of survey analysis and interpretation for us. They are also very actively kind of collecting and reviewing the latest empirical work on religious schools, and you will find that we are regularly releasing kind of more in-depth analysis from our main Cardus Education Survey via research reports through the Cardus Religious Schools Initiative. So for example, if you're interested in the relationship between attending a Christian school and the chances that somebody will enroll their own children in that Christian school, we have a report out at the moment on Christian school enrollment and the sector effect. We've got a science and religion report coming out. We've also got another report coming out shortly on comparing the US and Canadian data around generosity and giving. So there's a whole host of things coming out of this data at Cardus.
Beth, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. I put up on the chat box before people leave the information for the Cardus Religious Schools Initiative website.
Thank you.
And then we'll send out some follow-up information to be able to get connected with you and Cardus and more of the work that you do. And we really appreciate all that you do and all the work that you're doing and the fun conversation that we get to have with you about this.
Thank you.
So as we wrap up and send people on their way, just 2 reminders that on January 24th at 1 p.m. Eastern, we have another webinar with our friend and fellow Dan Behrens and Elizabeth Dombrowski of the CLC Network, and they're going to be talking about welcoming students of all abilities at your school, sharing their information, their work, and what they're seeing that occurs at schools and the quality practices. And then on February 7th at 11 a.m. Eastern, we have Embracing Everyday Diversity and a conversation with Justin Jones-Fosu about the idea of Christian schools and diversity in Christian schools. So we hope that you'll be able to join us. We'll stay here if you got any last questions for a little bit, but I'm going to stop recording.